At 06:17 a.m., 14th January 1944, at RAF Bottisham airfield in Cambridgeshire, the early frosted line of P-51B Mustang fighters sat idling. In the mechanic's blister-cold hands, 22-year-old Staff Sgt Frankie, Harrington, pressed up the radiator flap on aircraft serial 42 Chrono 6811 and froze. The Merlin-powered Mustang's coolant gauge flickered dangerously high. A sketched memo in Harrington's pocket marked, "Overheat, do not idle above 2500 RPM under 15,000 halt FT, a nascent directive from North American aviation test reports. But the escort group for the next dawn's raid over Bremen demanded altitude. Harrington yanked a stray hose clamp, diverted coolant flow, and closed the flap a little tighter. Engines roared. Mustang 42 Chrono 6811 rolled and lifted into the grey dawn. As the formation climbed toward 30,000 left, ice creeping on leading edges, its cockpit quietly recorded a drop in drag, a rise in speed. But hidden in that trick was a gamble. If the cooling system mistreated the Merlin, disaster could wait. And for Frankie, the joke among the ground crew was this: one unauthorized change might turn a good fighter into a legend, or a wreck at 29,000 Talushefton archival log. P-51B, 15 NASN, 42 Wando 6811 exhibited overheating at 22,000 Talus FT, modified scoop arrangement trials scheduled. The air-to-air war would never be the same. At dawn, 7 February 1944, at RAF Bottisham, Cambridgeshire, the 361st Fighter Group's hangars opened into pale winter light. Frankie Harrington trudged through the oily deck plates, carrying a tool bag heavy with socket wrenches and radiator clips. The air smelled of cold steel and warmed glycol from overnight engine runs on the Mustangs. His focal point, Mustang 42 Chrono 6811, awaiting its rendezvous with 4 engine bombers over central Germany later that day. The Merlin V1650 3-engine, license built by Packard Motor Car Company, pumped out more than 1,450 horsepower at sea level. Its 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger let the Mustang climb high, where oxygen grew thin and enemy fighters faltered. Frankie's task: check coolant lines, oil radiator flaps, the belly scoop beneath the fuselage that fed the combined water and oil radiator matrix. As he crouched under the belly of the Mustang, frost forming on the curved intake lip, he noticed the flap actuator was sticking, the spring weak, the linkage sluggish. He rolled his eyes. It would cost him minutes, but minutes meant delayed takeoff, delayed escort, and longer exposure for the bomber crews. He swapped the actuator, tightened the clamp on the return hose, wrenched the inlet and outlet ducts free of bulge. The engine coolant temperatures should stay under 220 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude. The periphery margin was narrow. Frankie felt the weight. Every second he spent here delayed the mission. Every unnoticed crack in the duct could cost altitude or worse. At 08:45 he slid out and stood up, urine stinging from the cold, breath frosting in waves. He tapped the prop hub to ensure no looseness, then climbed into the cockpit of Mustang 811 while pilot Captain Thomas "Tommy" Drew did a walk around. Their eyes met for a flash. Drew trusted his crew chief. Frankie knew Drew would push the Mustang hard today. Berlin was the target, and he'd escort bombers until he could see the spires. The sound of idling Merlins filled the hangar row, like mechanical thunder waiting. Frankie inhaled the engine smell, the cold bite of winter at his neck. He closed the access panel, clicked it shut, and watched 811 roll out. Tomorrow they would fly high. For today he had done his job. And yet the flap linkage still twitched in his mind. In the log sheet, Frankie scribbled, "Radiator flap hydraulic check delayed until lunch. Clutch spring weakened." Tomorrow's altitude would test this. Marching toward 15,000 FT was routine for the Mustang squadrons now, but flying above 20,000 FT still pushed machinery and men. At 10:37 a.m., 9th of March 1944, Frankie stood on the grated maintenance pit at Bottisham watching 811's Merlin roar to full takeoff power. Its argon blue exhaust turned white in the cold morning. He listened to the whine of the supercharger gearing up, remembered reading the NARA AWR tests. The Mustang's laminar flow wing and fuselage drag reduction had given it a tactical Mach number of 0.78, superior to many Axis fighters. He recorded in his mind, coolant temp safe, oil pressure 85 psi, flap actuator clear. But then he saw the flap channel under the belly scoop, a small bead of red fluid. Hydraulic seep. The panel closing wasn't perfect. He called the flight line tech, and they flagged the aircraft for re-inspection after the mission. That afternoon, Mustang 811 climbed to meet B-17 bombers leaving Sudbury, its drop tanks jettisoned. Full throttle, Merlins singing in the minus 10 degrees Celsius air. Captain Drew radioed, "Squadron, stick tight, chain up. We're at 24,000 FT and closing on the target." Frankie leaned in the maintenance hut, watching the radar trackers flicker, hearing the muffled roar overhead. He thought of the crew that trusted 811 to bring them home, and of his own hours beneath the aircraft, arms wrapped in grease. He felt the fatigue of standing knee-deep in coolant mix, the cold drilling into his bones. The radiator flap issue, the hydraulic leak, hovered in his mind like a pending note in the logbook. At day's end, the bomber formation returned intact. The aircraft landed, taxied in, finished shutdown checks. Frankie opened the panel, found no obvious damage. The leak had held. He exhaled. Yet he knew that each unchecked drip was a countdown. He marked the log. Hydraulic pressure on belly flap at 1200 psi on test. Borderline. Recommend spring replacement. 1 week later, 17th of March 1944, the weather turned. Freezing fog over the field, runway lights glinting through mist. Frankie padded around 811, checking engine start sequence. He heard the roar of other Mustangs as pilots pulled their chocks, the crackle of ground radio chatter. The Mustang's belly scoop, the air intake for water and oil radiator, was key to its award-winning performance. The so-called Meredith Effect let heated air exit the radiator duct with a small amount of thrust, offsetting drag. But the system demanded tight tolerances. Any bulge, fissure or weight penalty would degrade the effect and reduce high-altitude climb. Frankie knew this as he heard the hum of 811's engine begin. He sat with his tool bag, the cold drilling into his fingers, remembering how many hours he'd clocked on that aircraft. Wiring harness reroutes, coolant hose replacements, flap actuator overhauls. Captain Drew gave the thumbs up. Frankie nodded. The Mustang roared forward, wheels compressed springs, brake release snapped. The aircraft lunged down the icy runway, prop wash flogging the mist. Frankie watched it lift, roll into a right-hand climb, flaps up, gear up, belly scoop closed to the correct position. He exhaled and for a moment allowed himself a quiet pride. His hands had helped this machine, his tweaks gave it wings, but then the vibration from the flap actuator seeped into his conscience. Not fixed yet. In the tent that night, Frankie joined the others, half-smoked cigarettes, cold coffee. They swapped stories. Old 811 climbed 9 minutes faster today, one tech said. Another, Drew said it held 430 beach at $26,000 aft. Frankie allowed the smile, but underneath, the linkages still needed full overhaul, and the commander's message awaited. Escort range will be increased to 900 miles, starting April. We'll be climbing to $30,000 FT routinely. Frankie put out his cigarette in the muddy ashtray, glanced at his boots caked with frost. Tomorrow would demand more than routine. Tomorrow's brief would announce, new escort altitude 30,000 FT. Radiators must hold under max climb. At 05:20 am, 30th March 1944, the field at Bottisham was soft, with thawing frost. Frankie arrived early, headlamp on, climbing into the maintenance pit beside Mustang 42 Kanto 6811. The mission, escort B-17s to the industrial heart of Germany, Magdeburg. Captain Drew and his flight were to climb to 28,000 Hasant FT after drop tanks emptied, then push to 32,000 Hasant for the return leg. Frankie reviewed the flight orders and noticed radiator temperature margin critical above 27,000 Sefter. He went through his checklist. Belly scoop, flap linkage, adjusted at last, tightened actuators, hydraulic pressure, P-51 500 psi, coolant system bled, glycol ratio 60:40 for thin air climb. The manual, dated January 1944, warned of supercharger overheating at altitude without adequate mass flow cooling. He polished the intake lip, then heard the growl of Drew starting the Merlin. He wiped grease from his hands onto his overalls, climbed out, and watched as 811 taxied into the gloom. Fog lifted as the flight rose. Frankie peeked at the timer clock on his watch. T0 equals 0600 liftoff. In the air, 811 cut through cloud base at 22,000 ft. Drew radioed. He quote, "Flaps up, gear homes, clear climb." Frankie imagined the radiator doors open, the belly scoop channeling cold air in, heated air rushing out, Meredith thrust adding a few mph. But at 25,000 ft he imagined the flap actuator vibrating. Should he have replaced the spring yesterday? No time. He caught the thought and shoved it away. At 27,000 ft over the North Sea, the formation met heavy icing in the prop wash. Drew radioed. Temps rising. Cooling system picking up load. Frankie's heartbeat accelerated in his mind. He knew what rising coolant temps meant. Viscosity loss, oil pump strain, possible engine seizure. He pictured the gauge in the cockpit, needle creeping past green into yellow. Moments later, Drew gave a thumbs up over the intercom. Holding 28,000 ft, dropping tanks. Frankie exhaled inside. They would push onward, but the flapline's whisper remained in his mind. On the ground later, log entry would read, "Coolant temp peaked at 220 degrees Fahrenheit at 28,000 Seft. Recommend full flap actuator replacement on next maintenance period." By 1st April 1944, Easter Sunday on the field, there was no rest. Frankie arrived for a scheduled complete overhaul of the belly intake system on 811. The hydraulic actuator was off, disassembled. He drilled, cleaned, replaced the coil spring, greased the bearing. During the process, he overheard the flight ops briefing. New escort profile, climb to 30,000 FD, proceed across Reich's Saar-Salzgitter region. Frankie felt a tension in the air. The war was pressing upward, altitude mattered, and every Mustang needed to hold high air. The Mustang's superior range with Merlin engine was now matched with the need for higher altitude performance. As he reattached the actuator, sweat warmed his brow despite the cold hangar air. He tightened the torque to spec, 28 to 32 foot-pounds. He replaced the hose clamp on the return line. He hunted for any bulge in the scoop's underside skin panels. The intake lips were crisp. The streamlined design allowed intake air to be slowed. Its pressure increased before hitting the radiator core. That was the fundamental of the Meredith effect. Around lunchtime, the squadron's engineer officer, Lieutenant Jameson, found Frankie bent under the belly panel and asked, "Frankie, you coming to the barbecue?" Frankie replied, "I'll be closer to 30,000 in 2 days. I'll take the brisket later." Jameson nodded, smiling but aware of the gravity. Every flight now risked thin atmosphere, engine straining, parasites of drag. Frankie felt the weight of it. If the radiator doors stuck or actuator failed, 30,000 FT meant sudden drop in performance, perhaps loss of escort coverage for B-17s. At 1540, he signed the maintenance release, P-51B, 15NA 42106811. Belly intake overhaul complete. Radiator system cleared for $30,000 FT operations. Crew Chief S. Sergeant Frank Harrington. He stood, stretched his limbs, then loaded his tool bag for tomorrow's early check. The next mission, brief. Bomber's target. Salzgitter. Mustangs to altitude $32,000 FT if weather allows. Cooling systems must hold. On 6th April 1944, the briefing room at Bottisham was warm, hazy with cigarette smoke and maps pinned across the table. Frankie sat off to the side, tool bag resting at his feet. The mission: escort dual-wing bomber formations deep into Germany. Altitude requirement, now 32,000 to 34,000 Talkerefu. Frankie swallowed, thinking of the numbers. Air density roughly 0.37 kilograms per cubic meter at 32,000 FT versus 1.0 kilograms per cubic meter at sea level. Cooling mass flow diminished accordingly. He reviewed the manual's caution. At altitudes above 28,000 kLft, radiator duct exit area must be maintained at plus or minus 0.25 inches to prevent back pressure and overheating. The Mustang possessed two complete cooling systems, engine cooling and aftercooling for supercharger fuel-air mixture. He left the briefing and walked onto the flight line, the rising sun glinting off the polished skin of 811. Captain Drew climbed aboard, waved. Frankie tucked into his ground pit again, measurement gauge in hand, verifying bumper tolerance of the intake lip edge. The cold air slid over his gloves. His breath puffed white. He felt the rhythm of the machine. Radiator fans barely audible now. Belly flap actuation sealed. At takeoff, the formation thundered down. The Mustang climbed fast, Drew pushing white line throttle. At 30,000 FT, Frankie pinched himself mentally. This was the ceiling they'd targeted. He visualized the flow, ram air in the scoop, glycol heated through the radiator guts, hot air ejected, Meredith thrust offsetting drag. The result was the Mustang retaining 400 MEP at 30,000 FT, some 100 MEP faster than the older Allison-powered version at that height. Suddenly, over the German border, Drew radioed, "Temp approaching red line." Frankie's mind raced. Coolant breach? Flap jam? In the pit he felt as though the machine itself called for help, but the flap actuator held firm. Quickly he signaled through a scratch pad. "Monitor below 2 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. If above, call immediate descent." The flight carried on. They reached 30,500 Lloyd FT and escorted bombers toward the target. Frankie exhaled into his collar, heart racing. The altitude envelope was now reality. After landing, Drew told Frankie, "If you hadn't done that overhaul, 411 today might have been 300. By 18th April 1944, early spring rain had turned the field to mud. Frankie trudged between hangars, boots slipping. His wristwatch showed so 4:53. He was to accompany 811's last pre-flight check before a major 3-day deep penetration mission into Berlin. He checked the coolant expansion tank, glycol level proper, oil cooler radiator housing free of debris, belly scoop flap linkage lubricated. He thought of the memo he'd tucked. Perform alternate exit duct size test on 811 to validate high altitude performance boost. The idea came to him months ago when he observed that the flaps were often slightly off specs, but the aircraft still climbed fast. The concept: adjust the exit duct area slightly to increase the Meredith thrust effect. He had no formal authorization, but he believed the principle from Meredith's 1935 paper applied. He didn't write the tweak in the log. He scribbled, "Minor fine-tune as per RM 1683, a nod to the original Meredith report. He closed the panel. At 06:15 the Mustang roared. Frankie watched as the formation lifted and angled toward Germany at climb angle. On board, Drew opened the throttle, supercharger whine climbing, altimeter climbing through 25,000, 30,000, $31,000 left. Frankie's heart synced with the climb. He could imagine the radiator doors opening, the hot air jolting outward, the roles reversed. The cooling system no longer purely parasitic, but slightly propulsive. The aircraft surged, and although Drew wouldn't know why, Frankie did. Suddenly in the cabin, Drew's voice crackled. Cooling system stable. Temps green, holding altitude 33,000 palotft. Frankie exhaled relief. The undocumented tweak he'd made, a tighter exit duct lip plus smoother flap motion, was holding. But the advisor voice in his consciousness whispered, unauthorized, risky, could be traced back if trouble. He shoved the thought away. Bombers reached Berlin target zone. Mustangs peeled off. The aircraft climbed on cloud layer rising ahead. Frankie pictured Germans looking up at the thin specks climbing above their reach. The mechanics on ground had given their guys wings. Frankie's gaze trailed imaginary rivets and coolant hoses. In the pit, he thought, if the flap actuator fails now, above 30,000 FT, it's over. But so far, so good. In the post-mission debrief, 811's equation would show climb time 8 minutes faster than previous sortie, a gain of roughly 300 feet per minute. On 30th of April 1944, the airbase was preparing for the upcoming D-Day raids. The requirement, long-range escort to Berlin and return at high altitude. Frankie rotated between field tasks, and his prototype thought, could the intake duct geometry be further modified? Could the radiator exit lip be contoured to improve thrust without overheating? The background. The Mustang's cooling assembly designed for the Meredith Effect had reduced fuselage drag and aided high-altitude performance. That morning, Frankie located a scrap section of ducting in the maintenance shop and cut a test piece, mock-fitting an alternate curvature of the exit lip. He taped a small gauge mounting point for potential thermocouple installation. Nobody asked, nobody noticed. It took extra time, but the time would pay tomorrow when 811 flew again. Later, the squadron briefing. Tomorrow we climb to 34,000 FT Mustangs, load full internal fuel, no drop tanks for return leg. Cooling systems must maintain internal temps under 230 degrees Fahrenheit at max climb. Frankie nodded along, his mind churning. He returned to 811, ran the test piece in the pit, visually inspected intake lips, verified flap response. He replaced one nut, retorqued the fairing screws, polished surfaces to reduce micro drag. As dusk settled, Frankie walked the perimeter of the field, listening to the echo of distant Merlins, the hum of ground generators powering radar equipment. He felt pressure, not just for his machine, but for the bomber crews depending on the escort. If the Mustang failed to climb, then bomber losses would rise. If 811 failed up high, it would fall behind, and bomber coverage would gap. He paused at the maintenance hut door, watched fog crawl over runway lights, thought of tomorrow's early start. Under his gloved hand, he touched his forearm, small oil-soaked stain from yesterday's hose replacement. He smiled grimly. He was ready. And yet the quiet test piece sat in his locker, waiting. At midnight, the log sheet would read 42 Tundo 6811 intake and belly intake modification, test piece installed for evaluation. At 04:26 a.m., 1st May 1944, the field at Bottisham was wrapped in mist. Frankie arrived at the pit beside Mustang 42 10:06 811. He checked his watch. T-46. The test piece he'd installed the night before still in place. His fingers steady despite the cold. He bled the coolant system again, checked glycol level, ran the belly scoop flap through its cycle. The gauge in the maintenance pit showed the exit duct lips within plus or minus 0.125 inch of spec, a tighter tolerance than factory. Without writing it in the official log, he tapped a small note. Altitude performance test monitor, temps and drag. He pushed the thought down. At 07:02, 811 taxied out, prop wash scattering fog. Frankie watched the formation roll, climb. He stayed, notebook and thermometer in hand, as the flight ascended. He keyed the radio to flight ops. 811 rad temp baseline hold below 215 degrees Fahrenheit at 30,000. The ground ops replied, "Copy. Good luck." His jaw set. He took a breath of cold air mixing with exhaust fumes. Up in the sky, 811 climbed through cloud base into clear air, altitude 32,000, then 33,000 of Harrington. Frankie kept his eyes on flickering lights of other aircraft, the echo of Merlin notes in his mind. At 34,000 FT, the radio crackled. Captain Drew to all. Temps green, holding formation. Frankie allowed himself another breath. The unauthorized modification held. But then something happened. At 34,500 FT, a quick dip in air pressure as the formation crossed a disengagement layer. The radiator flap stuck halfway open. In the pit, Frankie's heart leapt. The cooling mass flow would drop. Radiator temps would climb. He keyed radio. 811 radiator flap status, request manual override. On board, Drew toggled the manual lever. Flap responded. Temps ticked up, 221 degrees Fahrenheit, 223 degrees, 225 degrees. He dropped 500 FT. Formation followed. Frankie watched the readings. The exit duct lip contour helped. Temps rose slower than expected. The test piece had bought time. Minutes later, they re-established 33,000 FT cruise. Frankie sighed. The unauthorized mod wasn't perfect. It couldn't fix a stuck flap, but it had mitigated the worst. On ground later, while the wheels rolled back in, Frankie prevented a near disaster. In the hangar, Drew slapped his shoulder. "That's the fastest climb I've done in a Mustang. Fantastic job." Frankie nodded silently, aware of the margin they had danced on. In the maintenance tent that night, Frankie wrote in his private note, "Test piece confirmed, file for formal evaluation," but he did not enter it into the official log. The unauthorized tweak remained his quiet secret. He closed his notebook, lit a cigarette in the dark, the smoke drifting into the cold air. Outside, the runway lights faded. The war had tilted upward, and he had held the slope. Tomorrow's mission brief would raise altitude target to 34,000 to 35,000 Hochtiefte. The cooling system test had passed, but next hurdle awaited. By 8th May 1944, the 361st Fighter Group prepared for a long-leg mission. Escort B-17s to Leipzig and back. Estimated cruise altitude 35,000 dals. Frankie arrived on the line under dawn yellow lights, orange sky above. The modified 811 awaited. He brought out the test manifold he'd designed last week, a bracket to hold 2 thermocouples on the exit duct lip, conditionally approved under ground test only. He tucked it under the belly panel. No one raised an eyebrow. He rolled the panel shut. Quiet. Invisible. At T0 equals 06 to 10. 811 roared out, past the hangar, past the craters and barbed wire of the wartime base. Frankie watched it ascend until the engines were a faint whine overhead. In the pit he sat, notebook in hand, watching readings piped back from 811's onboard telemetry. Glycol temp 210 degrees Fahrenheit. Oil cooler 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Flap actuator pressure holding at 1,580 psi. Everything green. The climb continued. 34,000 FT, 30,500 left. Then 35,000. Frankie exhaled. The air temperature outside was roughly minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Density down to roughly 0.38 kilograms per cubic meter. The cooling system's flow was challenged, yet 801 held. He checked the nipple on the test manifold. Thermocouples reading slightly lower than expected. Exit duct contour effect confirmed. He felt the thrill of discovery, the charge of risk. Suddenly the radio crackled. Bandits at 36,000 FT, left wing. Frankie's heart jolted. dogfight above. The Mustang's climb had paid off. They were reaching altitudes where German fighters seldom could manage. On the ground, Frankie imagined the radiators inside 811 glowing with waste heat. The engine still alive, still pushing. He stood, stripping his gloves, thinking of what he'd done. He realized he was no longer just a mechanic. Today he was part engineer, part test pilot, invisible in the pit. The mission finished. 811 returned unscathed. Frankie ran his test piece data. Coolant temps lower by roughly 7 degrees Fahrenheit at 35,000 ft compared to baseline Mustangs. He locked the notebook and taped shut the test piece brackets. He walked away into the cold that night, hearing the Mustang's echo in his mind. At midnight, the flight ops log would record 42 Cano 6811 climbed to 35,000 ft no overheat, potential for performance review. Frankie closed his eyes, grin unspoken. On 12th of June 1944, Normandy had just been invaded. The air war shifted, targets became deeper. Frankie arrived at Bottisham under summer twilight near midnight. He found 811 parked on the line, wings heavy with dew. He retrieved from his locker a typed sheet. Modification request. Belly scoop exit lip contour to be adopted fleet-wide. Evidence. Test data 1 May and 8 May. The document bore no signature. He glanced around. The other mechanics were gone. He slipped the sheet into the official routing box. He then returned to the pit and pulled the panel. He did another manual check of the flap actuator, measured the exit duct lip with a caliper, still within plus or minus 0.1 inch of his specification. He envisioned 811's radiator warm air exhausting into the slipstream, pushing ever so slightly, reducing drag. The theories of the Meredith Effect had become a practical tweak under his hands. As he closed up, he heard Commander Major Paul T. Hayes stepping onto the line. Hayes told Frankie, "Harrington, you're doing solid work. Keep 811 sharp. This war is climbing." The Major's tone was thin, but real. Frankie nodded. The next morning, as 811 lifted off for yet another escort, this time to Ludwigshafen, Frankie watched the intake flash silver beneath clouds. He felt the height of stakes now. Bomber crews depending on the Mustang's climb, ground crews depending on no faults, the heat of battle shifting. The unauthorized mod sat inside the belly, quietly working. Later that day, 811 reported, climb rate 3000 ft per minute, reached 35,500 ft, toss green. Frankie's internal world soared. The tweak had passed real combat test. But he also felt fear. If this ever leaked, if the electronics recorded the test bracket, paperwork, if the flap had failed next mission, then the blame would hit him, not the designers. That night in the maintenance hut, the mechanics raised mugs of hot coffee. Frankie poured one for himself. He tapped the Yetert's modification request sheet inside his pocket. He let the steam cloud his glasses. He thought of one line in the Mustang manual. For full high-altitude operation, radiator door actuation must be fully functional. Any obstruction will reduce climb performance by up to 15%. He looked at his own hands, stained with grease, and felt the truth. Climb performance changes altitude, range, victory. In the early hours of 13th June, the squadron commander will mark Harrington's intake mod under evaluation on the morning flight brief list. His secret is nearing daylight. By mid-August 1944, the war's air campaign pressed farther east. Frankie sat during a twilight shift alone in the maintenance pit next to 811. The intake duct test piece had been removed and replaced with the factory version, but the specification dialed to Harrington's numbers had now been officially adopted across the P-51B and C fleet. The cooling systems were now rated for 35,000 FT operation without restrictions. The escort fighters could now match bomber altitudes deep into Germany. The historical records that the Mustang's coolant system and radiator arrangement positioned aft of wing, plus use of the Meredith Effect, reduced drag and improved high-altitude performance. Frankie's gaze roamed across the hangars, engine cradles, spare Merlins, toolkit trays. He noticed a new bulletin, F-51D Mustang. June 1944, belly scoop flap specification, exit lip plus 0.10-inch adopted fleet-wide. He dared to smile. He realized the unauthorized tweak had become official. He walked to the squadron bulletin board and read a typed memo. Ground crew attention. Maintenance interval on actuator spring changed to 50 cycles for flaps at greater than $27,000 FT. Frankie exhaled softly. That note, he'd drafted the change in his own invisible version. He touched the actuator spring on 811. It now bore the 50-cycle tag. His small world had shifted. In the quiet of night, he remembered the early sessions in the pit. Frostbiting, coolant trails, cables and hoses, the weight of tools heavy on his shoulders, the sterile hush of pre-flight, the roar of takeoff and climb. He thought of the bomber lads trusting the Mustang escort, of Captain Drew returning with wings intact. He felt pride, but also the burden of unseen responsibility. He whispered to the night, "We climb for them." At 16:05 on 8th September 1944, Mustang 42 1006 811 rolled to a stop at Bottisham after its final mission, escorting B-17s deep into the Reich. Frankie shut down the Merlin and inspected the intake and radiators one last time. The war would continue, but for the Mustang escort era, its shape was defined. The official performance gain was recorded. Mustang variants retaining 400 Mephier at $30,000 FT, matching bomber altitude and outpacing Luftwaffe fighters. Frankie closed the access panel, walked away. He walked across the tarmac, the sun low, shadows long. In quiet months ahead, his modification would be credited in internal engineering bulletins. The men on the bomber formations would never know his name, but they'd feel the wings. In a debriefing note dated October 1944, the group commander wrote, "Escorts able to reach 34 to 35,000 FT with full fuel and drop tanks, cooling systems cleared." Frankie tucked the memo into his personal files. Years later, when the war ended, Frankie would remove his uniform, recall the smell of glycol, the hiss of radiators, the cold fingers under the intake lip. He would recall the gamble, unauthorized tweak, silent log sheet, higher climb, fewer bomber losses. He would remember the sense of motion and consequence, and the archived truth remains. The air intake under the wing and the ducted radiator design of the P-51 enabled the Meredith Effect, turning waste heat into slight thrust, reducing drag at altitude. Frankie Harrington never soared as a pilot. He repaired, modified, improved. But through his hands, one Mustang became unstoppable at altitude. The war above Germany changed, and so did the men who built the wings.